Hello class, hope you're doing well today. This is week 4 and we are going to go over chapter 5, Asian Americans and the Criminal Justice System right now. And again, we've gone over African Americans, we've gone over Hispanic Americans, and now a little bit different is the Asian Americans and the criminal justice system. So this is a shorter chapter, and you'll realize why after we start discussing things in this chapter. As far as any questions that you may have or concerns or issues, please post them on the discussion board, or if it's something that you want to just contact me about personally, go ahead and email me. All right, here we go for chapter 5. The book does a very good job about discussing Asian Americans and issues concerning Asian Americans. So is anybody in class of Asian American descent? Or do you know any Asian Americans? What do we know about Asian Americans? Well, there's a lot of interesting facts and figures and research that's been done about Asian Americans, which may surprise you. So some of the concerns that the book talks about is that Asian Americans are underrepresented in all criminal justice issues, whether it's arrests, convictions, imprisonment, incarceration, parole, probation. They're underrepresented in all of the issues of criminal justice. Protesting, this culture is just very underrepresented. And we'll talk about some reasons why. In California, prison system, Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, there are 4 designations for ethnicities. There is black, white, Hispanic, and other. The smallest number of those is going to be other, and that's where you have very few Asian Americans. And working in the prison system for about 4 years, I think I saw 1 Asian American prisoner, and I never had an Asian American on my caseload when I was a parole agent for many years. So that's how underrepresented Asian Americans are, in my experience, in the criminal justice system. There's not enough study done because there's not enough issues for study. There's not like a whole big, column of Asian Americans that are committing crimes to be studied. So again, there's not enough information out there. There's less presence than other groups, both in the system as far as criminals and as well as on the other side of working in the criminal justice system, whether it's an attorney, police officer, correctional officer, judges, things like that. So the Asian Americans retain a lot of their culture, much of their culture. And there's some distinct issues when it comes to 2nd and 3rd generation born in the United States Asian Americans, because the grandparents and parents may want their kids to have the culture that they were used to back in what Asian country they came from. And so the dichotomy here is that the younger generation kind of wants to be more Americanized and not really have anything to do with the old culture. So generally, the older Asian Americans retain much of their culture, not necessarily the newer younger Asian Americans. Asian Americans have always outpaced other groups in education, always. And not sure why. A lot of speculation is that in many Asian countries, working 6 days a week, going to school, it's very strict. Parents have complete control, and there is a push for education. There's a push to make it well in the workforce, to have money, to have things. So it's a different little culture than we have here in the United States, just a little bit. There is some racial profiling going on and biases, and we talked about, let me see, we will be talking about Asian Americans and hate crimes in a different chapter. Actually, in week 10, we'll be talking about hate crimes, and we'll talk about how Asians are targets of hate crimes and there's bias against Asians Americans. So again, those are some of the concerns that the book talks about, and they detail that in the book much more than we're going to go over here. Okay, so going through some history, as you can see, these are Asian railroad workers, and much of the workforce was immigration due to discovery of gold in California. So a huge influx of Asian Americans, or Asians, I should say, came from different countries, mostly from China. And these Chinese Americans, who later became Americans, they were the labor force that worked mainly on the railroads. Initially, they were a threat to the Americans that were here or the indigenous people, but they were very cheap labor, they were hardworking, and they were very quiet. So they were not a threat after all. But mainly, you see them working on railroads. So they built, most Chinese built the railroads that we still have today all across the United States. Japanese Americans, different culture. They were initially less of a threat because of the experience with Chinese people shaped their treatment. So when the Japanese Americans came over, they were not necessarily a threat. The term yellow peril, you need to look that up and know what it means. You'll have to look that up and let me know what that means. It's in the chapter. It's in a terminology, so it's important to know about what that was and if we still have that today. As far as Japanese Americans and the treatment within the criminal justice system, what is this a picture of here, do you think? Lower right. Are these Japanese people waiting to go to a concert or get into a pachinko palace? Or are they here for, what is going on here? Well, World War II occurred, and when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, immediately after that, the president declared war on Japan, and therefore, most 99% Japanese that were in the West Coast, on the West Coast states, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Washington, Oregon, were immediately put into internment camps. So these were American-born Japanese. These were people that were born in the United States that had worked here for years, had shops, owned land, owned houses. They were put into internment camps. So this is an internment camp. And if you ever get a chance to go visit some of the internment camps, some of them are still there. We're going to watch a film called Manzanar very soon, and it details some of the life in those camps. So it's interesting that it's not like there were Japanese people that were just here on a visa and they were imprisoned in these internment camps. It was American citizens. They were Americans that were put into these internment camps because of what happened at Pearl Harbor. So it was a terrible situation that occurred. And once these people got out of these internment camps, they had lost their businesses, they had lost their houses, so they had to start again from nothing. So it was a very bad time for Japanese Americans in our history, and we should never forget this. So reparations or payment was sought, and it was sought for many years that some Japanese Americans filed suits against the federal government and state government wanting some reparations, wanting some money for what they had lost. I mean, in the camps, these kids went to school, they played sports within the camp, which had barbed wire and armed guards. So it was basically in a prison. Okay? So in 1998, money was provided to all or the next of kin that were imprisoned during the during the internment that began in 1941. How much money do you think was allotted for these people, Japanese Americans, that were interned? How much do you think it was? $10,000 a person, $50,000 a person. How much do you think? How much should it be? $20,000. Was $20,000 worth being imprisoned for 3 years? Probably not. Could never repay that. So today, what's the status of Japanese Americans? They're called the model minority. That means that they're mostly model citizens, but they're a minority amongst those citizens because there's very few compared to African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Caucasian Americans. and they're very prosperous as a people. Very prosperous. Much more so than other cultures and other races that are here. Now we're going to move to Korean Americans. Again, very different. Chinese, Japanese, Korean, American, very different cultures. Very different. Early 20th century, they were recruited to work sugarcane fields in Hawaii. So a lot of Korean Americans came to Hawaii and became American citizens in Hawaii. After the Korean War and in the 1970s and 80s, immigration for Koreans exploded here in the United States on the mainland. A lot of people coming in seeking better futures, better jobs, and better economics. Small business ownership grew. So the Koreans that came here, much like their other Asian relatives, prospered. Okay, they saved their money. They didn't believe in banks. They put their money underneath their mattresses. They didn't fool around with law enforcement. They obeyed the laws, and again, they prospered. In 1992, the Los Angeles riots, Korean Americans were targeted because they owned a lot of stores where the riots occurred, and many were burned and looted. And again, it's a very, very scary scene, which we'll see more of and talk more of in a different class coming up, probably around week 7. We'll talk about the Rodney King incident and the LA riots and how that affected race relations and multicultural situations, especially with Korean American store owners. Southeast Asian Americans, Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians. They're, according to the book, least likely to speak English fluently, less likely to have higher levels of education in the United States, more likely to be in low-paying jobs. And again, this is what the book says. This is statistically what the book talks about. So again, if you know any Vietnamese or Cambodians or Laotians, I do, and some fit this mold and some don't. So it's not a never say never, always say never situation with these statistics that we see. As far as Pacific Islanders or Hawaiians, they have a greater familiarity with English. So speaking English comes much easier and more fluently. More likely to be educated. Again, the Pacific Islander or the Hawaiian person. Military influence as a way to assimilate. There are very large military bases in Hawaii and in some of the Pacific Islands. So those American military folks obviously speak English. So a lot of the culture in Pacific Islands and Hawaii is dictated because of the military influence. And there's 2 terms here. There's endogamy, and that means people who marry others with similar backgrounds. And there's exogamy, which is a high incidence of marrying outside of one's group. So you need to know those different terms there about who people marry depend on what their generation is, first of all, and then their culture. Whatever your culture is, your race, do you marry others with similar backgrounds, or do you marry outside of one's group? Those are 2 terms you need to know. Filipinos, one of the largest segments of Asian American populations that are here. I knew a lot of Filipino Americans that worked in the prison system with me. Some were correctional officers, some were cooks, some were psychiatrists. So they run the gamut of jobs that I knew of personally. More likely to be educated. Again, military influence as a way to assimilate, because in the Philippines there used to be an Air Force base called Clark Air Force Base, and it was gigantic. It was like a huge city of Americans that was there. And so again, the assimilation of life for the Filipinos there grew around the military base. That base closed a few years ago, but it was there for 50 years and it was huge. So it had a huge input on the way Filipinos lived near those bases, especially Clark. The Indian subcontinent includes Hindu, Muslim, Sikhs, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Trinidad, Tobago, and Guyana. So these are some of the Asian Indians that the book talks about. So those would be included in the Asian lesson plan that the book talks about. And again, as we go along here, these get smaller and smaller as far as these folks that are here in the United States. Most understudied group, these Indian subcontinents, because there's not a lot of these folks that are here, but they have very high levels of education, income, and family structure. So again, different way of living, different way of being brought up, come to the United States, and they thrive, mostly. So now we talk about the Asians in the criminal justice system. Again, very low levels, very much not represented, very much underrepresented, unlike African Americans or Hispanic Americans. So again, think about the last time you heard or saw on TV or in movies the Asian American that was put into custody or committed a crime. So again, it's very, very low representation. As far as Asian gangs, there are some Asian gangs in different countries like Japan and China. The Triad gang is a huge international gang that have criminal enterprises all around the world. We're not going to talk too much about that. The book talks about that a little bit. We'll go over gangs in a different chapter. But as far as Asian gangs, there's Asian street gangs that are in various socioeconomic areas in various large cities that are made up strictly of Asian young men. Human smuggling, the book talks about the snakeheads, Chinese human smugglers. There's a prevalence of women in the trade that are in charge of human smuggling to different countries of females or other males for slave type work. So again, there's some relationship with that as far as some of the Asian folks, not many. Criminal justice system, talked about transnational organized crime. The Yakuza is a very well-known international organized crime syndicate that, depending on who you talk to, is very prevalent and influences a lot of political issues that go on worldwide as far as organized crime. Finally, we have some questions. So again, what you should do is answer these questions. Write down your answers. You don't need to send them in, but just keep them for a later time for maybe an exam or a pop quiz. So again, there's some terminology in here. Assimilate, model minority, glass ceiling. If you don't know what those terms mean, make sure you do, because you can use these terms in anything that you write about, whether it's a position paper or anything else that you have pop quiz. So again, make sure you read this chapter. And again, it's not a long chapter because, again, Asian Americans are the lowest represented in the criminal justice system. And our goal is to figure out why and try to replicate that so other cultures and races can do the same thing. Okay, if you have any questions, please put those on the discussion board or email me, and we will get back to you soon. Thank you.